Good morning, everyone. Greetings from Vancouver, British Columbia. My name is Joe Weiler, and I'm Professor Emeritus at the University of British Columbia, the Peter A. Allard School of Law, where I taught for 46 years until I retired a couple of years ago. So on behalf of my fellow directors of the Anti-Corruption Law Program, that would be John Ritchie, Norm Baldwin, and Alex Komaroff, I welcome you to today's webinar. So the Anti-Corruption Law Program has been running now for 8 years this month, actually. And it's a joint working partnership of the Peter A. Allard School of Law, the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute, VASHI, and Transparency International Canada chapter. And in 2016, those organizations combined resources to organize top quality continuing professional education. And since then, we've been done over 50 conferences, seminars, colloquiums, and webinars like today. And in these events, we have been very privileged to pull together leading experts in the field of anti-corruption to teach each other and our registrants about best practices to fight corruption. So many thanks to the folks at the founding organizations for their support, for the nature of their kind of collective action in professional education, who've been key elements to put these sessions together. Special thanks to Dr. Carol Liao and the Center for Business Law at the Allard School of Law, and her crack technical team, today led by Nicole Suderman, who make these webinars possible. And UBC sits on the traditional unceded territories, and we express gratitude to the Musqueam Nation, the Squamish Nation, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, and the Saysix Nations, for allowing us to work from your territories. My privilege now is to introduce my colleague, Norm Baldwin. Norm is our moderator today. Norm conceived of and looked through his digital Rolodex to organize this webinar with colleagues of his in the area of investigation from around the world, really. So Norm's a wonderful colleague, and what a privilege it's been to work with him in the last few years. He himself is an ACE investigative professional with over 30 years experience working in North America, South America, Africa, Europe. And today he's called together his colleagues for today's panel. So thanks, Norm, for all of your efforts to make the Anti-Corruption Law Program a success, and specifically to organize today's webinar. And thanks in advance to the experts on our panel for taking the time and making the effort to share their insights with us, so that we can all learn. And I'm really looking forward to learning. This is not an area that I know that much about, not ever being an investigator. So I look forward to today's webinar. And over to you now, Norm.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome everyone to another installment in our continuing series of seminars on how to combat corruption and financial crime. In many of our previous seminars, our panels have featured law enforcement officials, compliance and anti-money laundering officers, academics, IT and security experts, regulators, policymakers, and even legislators. And while these groups are certainly integral to the anti-corruption fight, so too are the researchers and the investigators who roll up their sleeves to do the digging and reporting these groups rely on to develop and implement effective anti-corruption policies. But very often, those people and groups, the actions that those people take are in reaction to the research findings they've been presented with. So today we want to speak with and learn from some of the unsung heroes in the fight against corruption, the investigators. The people who don't just dig and dig to come up with information, but know where to dig, what tools to use, and how to report their findings. This is the first time that an anti-corruption law program webinar has focused solely on investigations, So it'll be a terrific opportunity to shed some light on the profession and learn about how one enters the field, what skills are needed, how an investigation or research project is structured, the pitfalls to avoid, the accessibility of public records, useful and not so useful OSINT tools, personal stories, and much more. So now it's my very great pleasure to introduce our panelists. First off, we have Adam Ross. Adam's been an investigative researcher for the past 15 years. After cutting his teeth researching corruption and human rights abuses for civil society organizations, he began his career as a corporate investigator in the UK and then started his own firm from his kitchen table in Vancouver. He's now a partner at Templeton Research, which is a due diligence and investigations consultancy he founded back in 2019. He was an investigator for the Cullen Commission, which many of you in the audience will know about, as well as for Peter German's Dirty Money Review, and for Transparency International, where he's now on the board of its Canadian chapter. And I must give full disclosure here, Adam and I have worked on various projects together, and I am forever grateful to him for introducing me several years ago to the anti-corruption law program. So Adam, thank you and welcome. Next, we have Alexander Silvert, or Ali to his friends, and we are all friends here. Ali was a state and federal public defender for 36 years. He retired in 2020 as first assistant in the Hawaii Federal Defender Office, and it is from Hawaii where Ali joins us today. In 2000, he was named, along with several other recipients, as the Federal Public Defender of the Year. And in 2021, he authored the extraordinary book, The Mailbox Conspiracy, of which I am honored to have an autographed copy. And that book details how Ali represented a client who was initially charged with stealing a mailbox, but was then framed by the Honolulu Chief of Police and his prosecutor wife. And this led to the largest public corruption case in Hawaii history, and subsequently a number of additional public corruption investigations and indictments of high-level government officials. And that process is still ongoing, and includes the creation in 2022 of the King Commission, which was designed to recommend new anti-corruption laws and rules of conduct for the Hawaii State Legislature. Ali, welcome to the panel. And that brings us to Cleo Pascal. Many of you who are active on LinkedIn may well be familiar with Cleo, as she reports regularly on the continuing power struggle involving the US, China, and the Pacific Island nations. And it is from one of those nations, Saipan, in fact, where Cleo is reporting to us today. Cleo is a non-resident senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington. She's testified before the US Congress. She regularly moderates and lectures for training seminars for the US military, and has taught at defense colleges in the UK, the US, India, Canada, and Oman. She's widely published in the academic and popular press and has written for a long list of publications, including The Diplomat, Naval War College Review, the South China Morning Post, The Australian, World Today, International Affairs, and she's currently a columnist for the Sunday Guardian newspaper in India. So Cleo, welcome aboard. And finally, we come to the one and only Abby Klein. Abby is a private investigator based in Oakland, California, and a recognized expert in locating and navigating public records. His practice focuses on supporting attorneys in complex civil litigation and related investigative matters, and I have no doubt that his law degree from USC probably comes in pretty handy in that area. But many of you may know Abby as possibly the nicest guy on the internet. He has legions of fans on LinkedIn, and if you've ever read his posts, and I certainly do pretty much every day, you'll know he's someone who's only too happy to share valuable information about the profession and point people in the right direction when their investigation needs a little help. And I can speak from personal experience here. A few years ago, I was needing some sort of obscure court records in the state of New York. I got in touch with Abby, and he very kindly showed me very quickly where to look. So Abby, thank you so much for that. And I'd like to start our discussion today with you. Organizations today, large and small, are having to conduct investigations for all sorts of reasons. Often this work is being conducted by compliance officers or in-house counsel, ombudsman, or others who might not really have experience in this area, which is why people like you often get called upon. So how did you get started in this business, and what sort of tips can you share to people who are wanting to get started, and what direction should they take?
Thank you, Norman. I very much appreciate you having me today and for those very kind words. I got into this business in a somewhat of an unusual way. I had been a journalist in Washington, D.C., and then I was an opposition researcher, which in politics, in the American political context, that means you spend all your days digging up dirt on your political opponent. I had been with the Obama campaign re-elect in 2012 for 18 months. And the way that works is the election is on Tuesday and Friday you're laid off. That's the end of it. And I was already an old man for that kind of a business. I was in my mid-30s and I needed a big boy job. And I knew there was a world of corporate intelligence in the United States. I didn't know much about it. And of course, I did what any investigator would do. I investigated it. And I was able to quickly talk myself into a job at a company called Mintz Group. It was one of the largest, most prestigious investigations firms in the country. In fact, around the world at the time, it had maybe 150 investigators worldwide, offices in China, India, throughout the United States. And that was the best place for me to learn this work. There's a difference between doing the work of research, where you just sort of produce research and someone else just kind of takes it and maybe they package it for an advertisement, versus having a client and needing to really be aligned with the different needs of your clients and to find out what they're looking for. In politics, you just sort of try to find everything because you never know what might be useful. But in the world of corporate investigations, you have limited budgets, you have limited time. You need to be able to focus very quickly on what it is the client needs, identify a roadmap in which to find it, utilize those resources efficiently at minimal cost if you can help it, and then produce a report in a way that is accessible, readable, and action-oriented for the client. And so, I always tell people who are interested in working in this business, the best way to learn this business is go work for a firm that does it. And people who are smart and are quick and figure it out, they will quickly get interesting assignments because there is a tremendous demand for smart, able, sharp people who can do this work.
You mentioned a while back in one of your posts that a good place to start for people would be actually in the field of insurance.
So there is a whole different industry in the world of insurance. And I actually think it's important to sort of distinguish the private investigations business in the United States is a regulated business, but it's actually two different industries. 99% of investigators in America are former law enforcement, people who they retire and then they do work. And most of the work they do is surveillance for insurance companies. And that can be a way to get entry into the investigations world. But in a large sense, that's a kind of a different business than the world of high-end, complex investigations where you're engaging in corporate investigations and fraud matters and litigation. We all have the same license. We're actually doing different things. I will hire surveillance guys. I do quite often to assist in complex litigation. But for an investigator, a younger person who is interested in really working on complex things, someone who wants to see interesting cases and go deep into the records, finding a company like Mintz Group, and there are actually a lot of, aside from large firms, there's actually a lot of very nice small boutique size firms. I'm a very small shop, but there are some very nice mid-sized shops based mainly in New York and in DC. I'm also in Los Angeles. And they are all up and hiring. I see their posts hiring, and sometimes they reach out to me asking if I know people, and it's a very good way for a young person to learn the business. I think it's probably the best way.
And when one of your clients, and again, I know that you work specifically for law firms, but when someone comes to you and says, we need an investigation done on a particular individual or a particular organization, do they give you steps to take, or do you create the entire investigation process yourself? And what steps do you take?
Thank you. I think that's a very good question. My experience has been that lawyers often come to the call wanting an investigation, but not having much of a sense of really what that would be, which is to say that they have a question. a factual question. There's something bothering them. There's something they don't know, and they would like to know it. And sometimes they have ideas, typically gleaned from television, about what might be possible. And the job of a good investigator, we are not robots and we are not people who are just directed to do a task. My job is to reflect back to the client my understanding of what their needs are, and then propose what I think in a professional sense would be the best approach. And that often does require me to tell a client, actually, I would suggest doing this other thing first, or
Mhm.
I don't think that that would be a very efficient use of your time, but I've seen matters like this before, and I would propose instead that we go in this direction, and then maybe the time will come that we want to do those other things. But an investigator who allows himself to be dictated or pushed around by the client is an investigator who's setting himself up for failure and disappointment.
Mhm.
And it's not a professional way to behave. My relationship with my lawyers with my clients is as professional colleagues. I'm technically a vendor to them, but they trust my judgment, and the reason that they call me again and again is because they want my opinion, and they expect me to know what to do.
Okay. So when you're going through your investigations, and this is something that certainly Adam and Cleo will know all about, myself as well. There's an absolute ocean full of online databases that can be accessed. Some you have to pay for, some you don't pay for. The list of new OSINT, as we call them, sources that are out there just grows exponentially every 5 minutes, it seems. I mean, I'm on a LinkedIn feed for all these various OSINT providers or data aggregators, and every day they're telling me, oh, this is the latest and greatest and fanciest new data source that you need to know this because it'll give you all this information. How do you keep up with all of this?
The truth is, Norm, is that I don't. I actually think it's something that's been a little bit poisonous in this industry, the emphasis on OSINT, which is to say that most of the information, the best information that I find is almost always going to be in public records. When you read books by some of the leading OSINT specialists, who I have no beef with and are very, very good at what they do, one of the most glaring things that's not in their books or on their websites is extensive discussion about accessing court records. But court records in particular, and also corporate records and corporate filings, when you have the ability not only to find what you're looking for, but to effectively read them and go through them and understand them, is chock full of information that OSINT can never get. And so what we have, unfortunately, I think right now is a situation where a lot of young investigators are spending a lot of time taking classes, trying to learn how they can tell from a shadow that this is a street in a little town in Bulgaria, which is a very interesting skill to have. And it may come in handy for some people, but in my work, it's not really very relevant at all. I will sometimes do a little geolocating if I'm trying to locate someone for a skip trace or something like that. I can see where they're posing on the balcony of their condo in Miami or something like that. But the neglect of public records in this segment, I think, is actually very bad, and more focus on reading, locating, and understanding what's actually already out there. Because I don't have to give any specific examples. It's quite obvious. When one person sues another person, they have to introduce into the record a tremendous amount of material about what they're alleging that the other person did. And if you subscribe to very, very powerful litigation search databases, PortLink from Nexus is the most powerful in the industry. In my view, I think it's a professional malpractice not to carry it, but many people don't. And I've had many times where because in PortLink, you can not only find dockets and records, you can keyword search across the documents themselves. You often find mentions of individuals and companies that other searches wouldn't find because it's in the document itself. So to give an example, there was a time once I was looking for a limited liability company. I was interested in this limited liability company. And I think most people realize that often you can't find much about a limited liability company. In a lot of states, it's easy to restrict information about them. They can be registered in Wyoming, where you don't have to put any corporate officers. Or you may see the company, but really have no idea what they do. You start Googling them, you run them through all your databases, and there are no indication. Is this a healthcare company? Is this a real estate company? Are they running a daycare? Like, what is this? But when I ran it through the database, I found a court case where the company was mentioned, and it said specifically, because it was related to the dispute, these are all the investors in the company that was in the litigation. And the company I was looking for was mentioned among the list of investors in the company. And then we understood what that company did. But OSINT is not going to answer that question for you.
We don't, there's those tools don't quite exist yet.
That's right.
And I see where a lot of providers, aggregators, and just OSINT tool developers, they'll talk about how we're using AI and machine learning is going to help to pinpoint potentially a corrupt official, or this will absolutely highlight, who that this person is corrupt, or that company is corrupt. And I do a lot of work in Brazil, and there's a number of developers there who sort of rely on some of these tools. Some of them are somewhat useful. They do give a probability that a particular politician is going to commit a corrupt act at some point based on previous activities. And those previous activities, as you point out, come from court records. So, when I'm doing an investigation in Brazil, first thing we've got to do is go to the court records. Public data, public records in the US, which is where you do the majority of your work.
Norman, I'm afraid you froze, so I missed the first part of your question.
Oh, am I back there now?
You're back, yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was going to ask you about, how accessible is public record data in the US? Now, you're a licensed private investigator. Do you have an advantage over, Joe Smith in the street?
I have some advantage in the sense that the large database companies such as Nexus and Westlaw, which have the best data out there because they've been collecting it for so many years. I mentioned these documents, such as Nexus, CourtLink has been uploading these documents, I don't know, at least 20 years. And so there's a huge tranche behind it, whereas all the newer companies are only just starting to load up their information. And you can only get access to these databases, even though it's not really restricted data, because they package it with other types of data that is restricted to private investigators. You can only get it if you have the license, or maybe a lawyer can get it as well. Okay. But it is one of the most remarkable things about the United States that records are completely presumed to be public. This is something that is very hard for people outside the country to understand, because that is not the standard anywhere else. You have some degree of access in Canada, and then a real quickly declining level of access once you move into Europe, into Asia, where often, for instance, in a lot of European countries, unless a person has been convicted of a crime, you can't find a record that they were ever accused of it, unless you find a newspaper report.
Right. It will
but in the United States,
okay. No, go ahead.
But in the United States, every single type of lawsuit is considered to be a public record. The main, most notable exception being in New York, where divorce records are presumed sealed. But to my knowledge, that's the only state where that's the case. And it is quite an incredible thing that I could just go and pull anyone's divorce file, and I can see all the information about the child custody arrangements and their financial disclosures that they had to give in the divorce file. That's just standard here. And it makes it so that I can do my work in a very, very effective and efficient ways. And the more database coverage I have and the more skill I develop in utilizing them, the more effective I am. We often see, if you read the New Yorker or the New York Times Magazine or other national or international magazines, you'll sometimes see, it's almost an evergreen story, reports of private investigators in Europe getting arrested and in trouble because they're bribing officials and they're doing all kinds of misdeeds like that. And the reason is because they don't have access. So information that I can obtain, for instance, someone's home address, I can obtain in 1 minute here. In lots of places in Europe, you have to commit a corrupt act just to get information like that. And that's why these guys get in trouble. But I don't have to do that here. And I'm not really, I'm never even tempted to commit a corrupt act because it's not necessary. I mean, I want to, but it's not necessary.
Do you have, oh, we have a question from, so I know Adam, and I'm glad you mentioned about data sources in Canada. I know that Adam will be wanting to talk a bit about that. because he's certainly has a fair bit of experience of dealing with data sources, not only in Canada, but also in Europe. And I'm glad you mentioned Asia, because I know Cleo has to dig through those as well. So we'll be getting to that. You say it's so easy to get data from public record sources in the US. Do you have to cross-reference or cross-check any of those sources? I know that when I'm working in Brazil, I'll be looking at a database and think, hey, this is great. But then I wonder, well, actually, how accurate is this? So I've got to go to literally 4 or 5 other ones just to really hit the common denominators and say, okay, I guess really this person does live at that place.
That's a really good question. So my policy and how I was trained at Minsk Group, which I said is a leader in the field and also a company that had always prided itself on ethical investigations, and I've really internalized that, is I don't report directly off a database almost ever. I want to see the original document. And so if I see a record that there was a lawsuit or a database says there was a tax lien, I want to go see the original file. And the reason is one, databases sometimes make mistakes, which is say not because it's fake, not because it's wrong, but because we're dealing with a computer that is taking in fields and populating fields into the database. And sometimes things get switched, or sometimes something gets coded as something, a type of a lien or something, but incorrectly. And only if you look at it directly will you come to understand, no, actually it was the other way around or something like that. The other reason to look at the original document always is because there could be a lot of additional information. In the databases, they only have fields for things that are predetermined. So that's just what you're going to see. But when you look at the document itself, there may be very valuable additional information about other parties who are on that document, or other transactions, or there may be an address on that document that changes the way you're thinking about the case. And so I will never report directly off a database. The only exception being, for instance, if I find that I can't find the document, it's been destroyed, it's so deep in archives and the client doesn't want to pay to have it pulled out or doesn't want to wait because it could take quite a long time. But then I will always have a line at the end which says, further research would be required to confirm the findings or something to that effect. Because I don't want to be responsible for verifying the truth of something if I can't see the original document. And fortunately, they're very easily accessible. And with court records, it's an easy thing to call the clerk in any court in America. And if you're nice, it doesn't work as well with a big city, but certainly outside of New York or Los Angeles or something like that, if you call the clerk and you say, I'd like to have this file, can you send it to me? They'll say, okay, sure. Maybe they might ask 10 cents a page. It might take a few weeks, but they'll send it. And if I want it quicker than that, I will just hire another private investigator at a very reasonable rate to just run down there and make copies of it for me and send it to me. It's not an obstacle at all if you just know what to do. And putting in that extra step every time. No, we're not satisfied with the databases. Yes, I do want to see that record. I am going to look at it. That's what separates the mediocre investigator, the lazy investigator, from the effective and successful investigator. And that's what shines to the client, because very often the client sees the report and is like, whoa, look at that. That was very interesting. That guy got a copy of this financial disclosure from them. I didn't know you could do that. And even in cases where the information that you find doesn't necessarily advance the case in a big way, it can be very impressive to the client. And then you also don't know later on down the line. Sometimes it happens that you're doing follow-up work and then you realize, oh, I did pull down that record. Oh, now it makes sense what that address was. It wasn't context. I didn't have context at the time. Now I have context. And so when we do investigations, the first thing that we do is we suck up all the paper. That's the first thing I want to do. I want every piece of paper in the world that's got this guy's name on it or this company's name on it. Whatever's in the public record I can get. I want all the corporate filings. I want all the litigation. I want the liens. I want all the UCCs. I want everything. Then we'll do source inquiries. Then we'll take next steps. But the first thing I want is all the paper. Then we see it.
Super, super. Well, I hope all of you out there in the audience now have a better idea of what it's like to conduct this type of investigation in the U.S. As Abby's pointed out, The data is readily available. You don't have to spend a fortune to go and get it. And it's not necessary to go and necessarily cross-check from 5, 6, 7, 8 different sources. But I think the key one that the takeaway, if I can use that term, is get the original documents. Because then it takes all the argument right out of it. So thank you very much for all of that, Avi. Greatly appreciated. We'll be back to you for some other questions later on. And now I'd like to move on to Ali Silvert. And Ali is coming to us today from the beautiful island of Oahu in Hawaii. Ali, you were involved in an absolutely amazing case right at the tail end of your career as a public defender. If you could just maybe give us a summary, because it's a book-length story, probably a movie-length story now. I'm sure that you've probably got Hollywood writers circling around you. But if you could just give us a summary as to, first of all, what type of a researcher or investigator history did you have prior to that case in terms of your skills and so forth, and how were those brought to bear when you finally got into the mailbox conspiracy?
Well, good morning, everybody, at least from Hawaii. So I come from this discussion from a little different place, because I'm a lawyer working with investigators. And I'm really happy I'm coming after Avi just spoke, because I have so much more to comment based upon what you said. Before, I kind of, as a defense attorney, I represent corrupt public officials usually. But in this particular case, so I work with investigators. Every federal public defender office has several investigators. And one of the things I was going to add to Avi's talk about how to break into the investigation field is maybe work for a federal public defender's office, because we all hire investigators. It's a great training ground, and it's a great place to start. And we have all the tools because the federal government pays for everything. And I work with them, so I kind of have a different view of how to work with an investigator, but it kind of dovetails what we just spoke about. So I come from, where I've learned to work with investigators and to trust them and to know what I need from them and to respect a good investigator versus a lazy investigator. And you can really tell the difference when you see the two different investigator type works. So in my particular situation, my background was working with investigators. In terms of the case that has propelled me to where I am now, in 2013, I represented a client who actually got arrested for stealing a mailbox, the entire mailbox from in front of someone's residence. I took the case myself because I assigned the cases because I was looking for anything different. I'm used to drug cases and bank robberies and white collar fraud cases. And this was so unique and so different. I'd never seen anything like this in my criminal history career before. So I took this case. And what we uncovered over the course of a year and a half was that this individual had actually been framed for stealing this mailbox that belonged to the Honolulu chief of police and the third highest ranking state prosecutor in Hawaii, and that he was their uncle, and that he had filed a civil lawsuit against them for stealing over $160,000 from him and his mother, who was in her 90s. And they framed him in order to get him convicted of a felony, so his credibility would be destroyed in the civil suit that he had filed against them. We investigated the case for a year and a half and uncovered a massive conspiracy by the chief and within members of a secret police unit within the police department who were framing him for this crime. We ended up going to trial in 2014. The chief, I believe, in the middle of the trial, threw the trial in his testimony by saying something that was impermissible and that he knew was impermissible. And after that, we had to make a decision whether we were simply going to hold our evidence proving that he had been framed, because we had not disclosed any of it to the prosecution, or whether we were going to take the risk and go to the prosecution and go to the FBI and show them what we had uncovered. We made that decision to approach the US Attorney and the FBI with our information. And what ended up happening was a special prosecutor from Washington, D.C. was appointed by the Attorney General to come to Hawaii in 2014 to investigate this case. He is still here. He's still prosecuting cases that he uncovered. And by 2017, the chief of police and his wife and a whole bunch of police officers had been indicted for their part in this conspiracy. And in 2020, they were all but one were convicted and sent to jail. I then retired. And since my retirement, because of this work, I've become kind of a spokesman for anti-corruption issues in Hawaii, working with various commissions and politicians and other people trying to change the culture here and trying to get new laws and ethics rules passed that will help the legislature and Hawaii government become more ethical and less corrupt as we are right now.
Wow. So I met you some time ago over in Hawaii, and you went through the story, received the book. I read the book, and it's an amazing story. How could something like that have occurred in Hawaii? I mean, it's so extraordinary that you would have the chief of police and all these other police officers involved in such a corrupt act that involved so many people over such a small amount of money, and yet everybody sort of went along with that. So is this something that's sort of specific to Hawaii? And I know I'd like to talk to you about a bit more about this. We have this these comments that are often made that Hawaii is the most corrupt state in the United States, and depending on how you interpret that, I know that you will defend that comment, as your colleague Randall Roth will as well. So could you explain to our viewers out there why Hawaii is essentially as corrupt as it is, and how a practice like that, with all these police officers, police commissioner, the attorney general, etc., how could all these people have been involved in such a ridiculous crime?
Yeah, I mean, we are an island state. It's a very small community of people. The culture is Ohana, so we're family. Everybody gets to know everyone. People go to high school together. High school here is the big thing. No one cares where you went to college. It's all about where you went to high school. It tells you everything you need to know about someone's political affiliation, cultural affiliation. So because of the mix of cultures that we have and the strong family tradition here, and because we're so small, everybody knows everybody. Everybody's related to everybody. And so you have families, these large families, where half of the people in the family are police officers and the other half are criminals. It's just the way it is in any kind of small society like this. And so everybody knows everybody. And so it's, part of our culture, unfortunately, is, there's a chicken fight that family members are going to, which is illegal, but somebody who's a police officer will reach out and say, hey, we're going to raid that chicken fight on Friday. Don't go. Now, is that corruption? It is, but it's also kind of like totally acceptable that a family member would tell another family member, don't go to that chicken fight because we're going to raid it. That has become an issue writ large with our legislature, because we do have this tradition where people donate money. In fact, this argument was just made to a jury the other day and was successful in that they got 3 defendants found not guilty, that in our society, it's perfectly acceptable to give large donations of cash to campaigns. It's not illegal. And then expect special assistance and to be able to meet with the politician or to be able to meet with the prosecutor because you gave a large donation. It's not considered corruption. It's not legally corruption, but in a sense, it really is, because you're using your money and your influence and your power to donate money so you can get that special access. We have that problem here. It's a cultural thing. It seems to be accepted, but it creates this whole system where there's a lot of room for corruption within the legislature.
There's a media outlet called Civil Beat in Honolulu, and it's a terrific outlet. If anybody out there wants to get a sense as to the current legislative situation in the state of Hawaii, Civil Beat is terrific. Their reporters are continually covering it, but they also have people like Ali and Randy Roth, who I mentioned, who contribute articles to Civil Beat quite regularly. And what Civil Beat also does is it has what's called a bill tracker, wherein in sort of almost in real time, it shows the passage of a bill through the legislative process in Hawaii, who's debating it, how long it's taking, how many days it's gone through, and who ultimately votes or for it or against it. And I would love to see a similar tool being used in other legislatures around the world. I think it's a wonderful thing. And I know that in one article that you had recommended to our registrants to read, which came from Randy Roth, actually an article in Civil Beat, he mentions that there's so many people in prison from the public sector in Hawaii at the moment, including legislators, prosecutors, police officers, planning and permitting workers, et cetera. I mean, the list just goes on and on, even a police commission chairperson. And his sort of description or his explanation for all this is that in Hawaii, you have to go along to get along. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there is that culture. People don't speak up. I mean, I've talked about the problem with whistleblowing in Hawaii, that we don't have many whistleblowers here. And again, it's because everybody knows everybody. If you whistleblow in Hawaii, you have to leave the state because you're not going to be safe here. Everybody's going to know you. It's going to affect your ability to get jobs. You know, in other states, if you whistleblow, you can move to another part of the state. You still have your friends and family on Ohana. In Hawaii, if you become a whistleblower, you have to leave the state, you leave your family, you leave your Ohana behind. So we have a real problem with people coming forward and telling what's happening. You know, in my case, there were a slew of people in the police department and in the prosecutor's office, you know, lawyers included, who knew what was going on and knew what these people were doing over time. Because, you know, my case was just one thing they were doing. They had actually done a bunch of things and never came forward and never spoke out. Because of this issue that we all know each other, we all went to the same high school, we all went to the law school together, and therefore it's very difficult for people to come forward. So it is an issue.
Now, here in British Columbia, where I am and where Joe and John and I are as well, we had something called the Cullen Commission, which was a provincial government mandated inquiry into anti-money laundering or the scope and scale of money laundering in British Columbia. A lot of that impetus to get the commission off the ground came from investigative journalists, people like Sam Cooper and others who were sort of pulling back the curtain on a lot of the activities that were happening here in British Columbia. Your work and that of Randy Roth and others in Hawaii led to the creation of the King Commission. Could you just tell us a little bit about what that commission was? It does have some parallels with the Cullen Commission.
Right. It's actually called the Foley Commission.
Oh, pardon me.
But so what happened was, as a result, I don't take credit for this, but I think my case kind of opened the door to it being okay for the local law enforcement, and it's usually the feds, not local, to investigate corruption again. Before my case came out, there had not been a corruption investigation really going on at all by any law enforcement division. But afterwards, it kind of opened the door and made it okay. So what ended up happening was a House of Representative and a Hawaii senator were found accepting bribes, and they were charged and convicted. And as a result of that, the Hawaii legislature created the Foley Commission, and as a result of my case, in order to suggest new laws, new ethics changes to help strengthen criminal penalties, to change the way business is usually done. The Foley Commission, which was a blue ribbon panel, came up with 31 suggestions. Some of them were rule changes, some of them were new criminal statutes, increased penalties. And unfortunately, all the minor suggestions for all of the changes were accepted and passed into the law, but all the 5 or 6 really serious changes, which included campaign finance reform, and term limits and so forth that really would address the issues and the problems that we have were not passed. And we'd hope this legislative session they would be passed. They were again struck down, which really shows you the resistance to change that the state and local government has, and how this is an ongoing struggle. So that's something we're still fighting, but it was at least an attempt. There were some changes made. It showed some movement. We're still fighting now to get the real reforms passed.
Keep fighting. Don't give up, because I mean, here in Canada, we've had, a similar situation where there was just this inertia for so long to get things, even like a public registry in place, but now beneficial ownership registry in place. Now these things are starting to happen. So progress can occur, but you do just have to keep bashing your head against the wall to make enough noise and have enough people doing it that the changes will come. I just wanted to ask you about investigators themselves that you worked with during the investigation of the mailbox conspiracy. What sort of qualities did those people have? I mean, how did they go about investigating corruption in such a unique environment like Hawaii?
Right. So I have to give a shout out to my investigators, because they were amazing and really led me by the nose through what they could do and how things were done. In a criminal case, we have a limited time frame in which to do our investigation, and we have limited information. So they really have to work fast. We don't have the luxury like in a civil case that can take years. Most of our work comes from digging things up and then getting subpoenas done. But what my experience with investigators, at least in the criminal field, is, and I think it dovetails what was said before, is, I need real facts, and I need them to be completely 100% accurate. I can't go into court and use something that is half truth or it can't be verified. So when an investigator reports back to me, I need that original document, because that's what I'm going to have to introduce in court or use. Or if a witness denies the truth, I need that original document to impeach them. When an investigator writes a report to me, I can't, if it's not 100% accurate, it's not useful to me and will actually backfire and make things worse. So I have to trust my investigators that they understand that I want the 100% truth. They can't hide by being lazy and saying, well, I assume this, but they don't tell me that. So I really value original documents and investigators really being 100% accurate. And the most important thing is go to the scene, go to speak to witnesses. It's not good enough to talk to witnesses on the phone. I mean, if you have to, you have to. But I want, real people spoken to and seen. I need a credibility assessment from the investigator of what that witness or that person is like before I speak to them. So I really value an investigator who does the legwork, who does the hard work, and is 100% accurate. And most importantly, since I am not an investigator myself, I'm a lawyer, I want an investigator to tell me what they can and cannot do. And I want them to be honest with me about that. Because as was said before, I live in La La Land. I'm not an investigator. I watch TV. So I think, go put a GPS tracker on this car or something. You can't do that. So I want an investigator who really knows what they're doing and can stand up to me as a lawyer, because I will treat them equally as a professional and tell me the truth of what they can and cannot do and make suggestions to me. And I will listen to those suggestions. I know this is not true for all lawyers. There are some really bad lawyers. They think they're kings and queens and they will direct everybody. But for the most part, we will listen. And that's what I'm looking for. So I would say an investigator really needs to be willing to go out in the field and do the legwork, find those documents. And I also agree that it's the document that has so much more information in it than just what's in a computer or on the records. Because even now, since I'm involved now with writing articles and talking about public corruption, I get the original documents that I'm talking about, and there's so much more information in there that the public doesn't know that is so helpful. So that's what I'm looking for in an investigator. And that's what, to me, makes up a really top-notch investigator. And luckily, I had that in this case because they're the ones who told me, you need to get this subpoena. You need to go here and do this. And I would do that kind of work, but they were directing me and navigating me through this whole thing.
That is fantastic advice, Ali. Thank you so much for that. I hope those of you in the audience were taking notes during that because, you know, there's just no substitute for getting the original documents and also speaking face to face with people. You know, having good interviewing skills is a tremendous advantage for a successful investigator. I have to do interviews myself from time to time. Unfortunately, a lot of them have to be done on the phone. I can't be traveling all over the world necessarily to meet with people, but you do have to have that sort of personable touch and be able to, you know, elicit information out of somebody, you know, get them to be willing to talk. And again, these are other skills to have, but certainly no substitute for getting the original documents. So thank you for that. I would like to move on now to Cleo Pascal, who is speaking with us today from the island of Saipan out in the Western Pacific. Thank you, Cleo. I know it's very early in the morning for you or late at night, one of the two, but I do thank you for this. It's greatly appreciated. To those of you who are avid readers and posters on LinkedIn, you probably will know of Cleo Pascal. She posts regularly on what is happening out in the island nations of the Pacific. There's a massive power struggle going on right now with warships from various countries crisscrossing each other, water cannons, all sorts of things going on, all sorts of allegations of corruption from various governments. And Cleo, you're right in the thick of it all. So how did you get started in this business and how did you end up reporting and investigating on corruption out in the island nations of the Pacific? Cleo has been frozen. That is a shame. So maybe we will move on to Adam if we can get her unfrozen. Hopefully, let's have a look. Maybe we'll move on to Adam and hopefully Cleo is coming to us from Saipan. So perhaps the connection. Oh, there we go.
I'm back. Yeah.
You're back. There we go. Did you hear my question at all?
No.
Okay, no problem.
Trying to think of who cut my line.
That's all right. So the audience heard my question, but I'll just repeat it very quickly for you. You're deeply involved in all of the shenanigans going on in the island nations of the Pacific right now. Lots of countries jostling for position. It's all quite entertaining to read about it, but what's it like to be living and breathing as an investigator and looking at all the corruption that's alleged and that is actually occurring?
Well, what's really inspiring is all the honest people who are fighting for their countries and their communities out here. There are a lot of them, really just incredibly inspiring, brave, smart, courageous people. So I mean, the problems out in the Pacific are very similar to what was just described in Hawaii in terms of being small societies, but even more so because you can't leave. I mean, in many cases, getting a visa to another country would be quite difficult, and they'll come after your family, you know, and they could be a whole different range of people. It could be people within your family. So it's to take a stand requires a certain level of fortitude and principle that is very inspiring. And so it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this particular fight alongside those people.
And the investigators out there, you know, it sounds like they're taking considerable personal and professional risks to dig into this information. Where do they get their data from? I would imagine that a place like Saipan or the Solomon Islands might not necessarily have the you know, the lovely structured databases that Avi gets to deal with in the United States.
So I mean, for example, one of the biggest people in the anti-corruption fight here in Saipan is the governor, and he's said Saipan is part of the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, which is a territory of the United States. It's part of the United States. These are American citizens. There's all sorts of peculiarities around Saipan legislatively. it is the only place in the United States where Chinese can arrive without a visa. And that's created a lot of it, ostensibly for tourism, but it's also created a lot of complications around things like the woman who ran the Bureau of Motor Vehicles here in CNMI has been found guilty of selling American driver's licenses to Chinese, and specifically to Chinese. Chinese have been found getting on boats and illegally going to Guam, where they've been found wandering around the military bases. These are all cases that have gone through the court system here. So Saipan is twice as far from Hawaii as it is from Japan or Taiwan or Manila. This is where the United States borders Japan. The United States and Japan share a border at Saipan, and in 2 days, actually the reason I'm here is because on the 15th of June, they'll be commemorating the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Saipan, which was sort of the D-Day of the Pacific. This was an incredibly important battle where it was a last stand for Japan. The Imperial Japan knew they lose here, then the B-29 bombers are in range of Tokyo, and the Enola Gay took off from Tinian, which is the neighboring island. You can see it from here. So this is America's front line with Asia, and it has very little oversight. I think Ali knows this very, very well in terms of kind of the challenges with prosecuting people out here. And when the governor came in, this new governor came in, he found the coffers suspiciously bare, and testified before Congress that he wanted a resident district attorney, he wanted the FBI to come in, he wanted Treasury to come in. So this is, I think, the only case I know where an American politician has said, please investigate me and my government. Well, I'll open up anything you want. Please come and take a look. And the federal government has been very slow to respond. So investigators, or people who we would frame as investigators, can come from all different sectors of society in a place like Saipan.
So one of the other islands that you were, commenting on or reporting from a lot was the Solomon Islands, which is in the same general region of the Pacific, although it's some distance from Saipan, but it's still susceptible to these same external pressures. So are the investigative challenges the same in Saipan as they are in the Solomon Islands?
It's much more difficult in Solomon's. Solomon switched diplomatic affiliation from Taiwan to China in 2019, and things changed quite substantially on the ground after that, including the signing of a security deal between China and the government. And so, what's happened? First of all, in that case, a lot of the investigation is done by extremely good local journalists who, again, have to be incredibly courageous. And it's not financially beneficial to be an investigative journalist in those environments. They're published, it's known examples of Chinese embassy and government-linked money going into publications that don't investigate China, or Chinese-linked activities. But if you are somebody who wants to do investigations, it's who's going to fund you? It's not. It's at least domestically, and who's going to talk to you is another thing. At least publicly, you become toxic potentially within your own society. But again, there are people, Ofani or May, for example, from In-Depth Solomons, who does incredible work at great personal cost and very little reward, except for knowing that he's fighting the good fight and representing. And sort of my case is a little different because you talked about sort of who your clients are. My client is really the kind of the public, and particularly honest members of the public who want hope and who want to know that what they're living through is, first of all, what they think it is, validated, but second of all is other people will find out about it, and then possibly something will happen to ameliorate the situation. So in that respect, people like Ofani in Solomon Islands is really leading the charge. But within the governments, you'll find, and this happens quite a lot, there are people who are not happy with the direction that their countries are going in. And that's where we get to this issue of documents and leaking. And you'll get people who, again, at great personal risk, will see a document pass through their desk that makes them very, very concerned. And one of those cases, for example, was that Solomon Islands China security deal. It was a draft was leaked. Sometimes you'll get lists of bank accounts where amounts were paid out for uncertain reasons, things like that. So in those cases, you know, you need to verify them very carefully, obviously, before you make them public. But this is where LinkedIn has become a very odd thing for me. Just to kind of get back to kind of how we met, because in my circles, you're warned away from LinkedIn. I mean, there are articles out there about how malign influencers will attempt to recruit people off of LinkedIn, especially looking for people with security clearances or things like that. And there are a lot of senior military on LinkedIn, in part because somebody may have done 30 years in the military. They might have joined at 21. They're in their 50s. They're actually in their prime, very knowledgeable, and they're looking for that second career. So in their final phase of being in the military, they'll go on LinkedIn to look for the next job. So it's a very target-rich environment for that sort of recruiting. Why don't you come and give a speech to our university students in our country, or whatever, that sort of thing. But what I've found it useful for with that same cohort is sometimes I'll get information that's not quite enough for a full story, but really I think would benefit from being out there. Because sometimes you'll get a document and I might understand about 10% of the implication of it. But I know there are people out there for whom it may complete a picture or give more dots to help them get further down the line towards something they're assessing. So LinkedIn has a limited word count, but you can post documents. So if I have something that I think might be useful for somebody else, that's a good place to just put it out with a little bit of context, and if somebody else can take it somewhere, then great. So all that to say that, you know, when you're getting a country in transition or under the sort of contestation that Solomon's is undergoing, you may end up with these documents that you then have to verify. But then once you verify them, I'm not the sort of journalist who's going to try to sit on it, you know, and use it to build up an exclusive. I want it out there, and let as many people run with it as it can be useful for.
Mm-hmm. I have a quote, actually. It's great comments, Cleo, and again, I actually, we did meet through LinkedIn. I spent a fair bit of time out in Micronesia many years ago, and you had a post one day about corruption in Micronesia, and oh, better have a look at that. And so ever since then, we've been communicating, and I'm honored to be chatting with you when we can about your insight and comments about the region, because there's so much happening out there, and it doesn't get a lot of coverage. You know, we see pictures of, you know, Chinese Coast Guard vessels, Philippine fishing ships, and U.S. You know, battleships and not battleships, but U.S. military ships out there, naval ships, and it's that's about all we really see. And, what's the context behind it all? What is actually the truth? What's actually happening? Where are the actual borders? And so forth. And so it's great that you are reporting from the region and letting us know sort of as best you can what's going on. I just wanted to read you a brief comment by Paul Radu from the OCCRP. I know it's an organization that a lot of people know. It's one of the sort of most well-respected investigative journalist organizations on this planet. And he's talking about how to structure an investigation as an investigative journalist. And he says it starts with the recognition that journalists are always a little bit behind. So you need to look at the technology that's used, look at the court cases where criminals get indicted, and look at what the criminals used. And then ask yourself, how can I use that technology? And so looking at these cases will give you information on what the criminals and law enforcement agencies are using. So do you have any sort of comment on that and how it maybe connects with how the path that you've taken to get to where you are today?
So OCCRP has done great work. They did very good work on the triads in Palau and on Solomon Islands. They've really done some very good work with the local journalists. So I'm a bit lazy. So I just go straight to the local journalists and talk to them. I'm much more about talking to people than I am about technology. But that's just me. That's just my penchant for preferring one thing over another. But in the Pacific Islands, what you get is, because these societies are so tight, and people are related to each other, and it's claustrophobic. Anytime you walk out the front door, you can run into anybody you've ever dated, anybody you've ever worked for, anybody you've ever borrowed money from. Like, they're just tight societies. They tend to communicate in ambiguous language, and silence doesn't mean that they agree with you. Saying they agree with you doesn't mean they agree with you. There's often an out. So if what you're doing is signals intelligence, for example, if you're intercepting communications or you're reading documents, that may not give you an accurate perception of what people are actually thinking or doing, or how they connect. So for me, I mean, maybe you can wave your AI magic wand over everything and make it all clear, but for me, going and sitting with people and watching them interact with each other, actually more than interacting with me, is very helpful. But it also builds trust, and that's where you can start to get somewhere in the Pacific. And I would also say, because the other area that I work in quite a bit is India, and India is also is similar, very similar. These are societies where it might look like people are talking a lot, but the information is being conveyed in a different way. At least that's what I've come to find. And in fact, the first corruption pieces I did, were about India. It's in around 2010, 2011, I was writing about Congress Party, Sonia Gandhi related corruption. And the reason I was because I had been in India writing about other things, and journalist friends in India were saying, these are really big stories, but we can't write them because we'll get audited or thrown in jail or whatever. But they are billions of dollars. And I was writing at that point, a lot of writing for the Huffington Post. So just by coverage of cases in the Huffington Post, that would give the Indian journalists the chance to cover somebody else was covering the cases instead, gave them that opening and that breathing space. So, but none of that could have happened electronically, including documents that, that I was given or discussions that I had. They had to trust me, frankly. And the same thing is true in a lot of in the Pacific Islands. They get a lot of people coming through. And you come through and you come into the Pacific Islands, there's like this top layer of sharks that feed off of people who come through, right? The aid workers or the diplomats or the journalists, and they know what to say, and they know how to take nibbles off of you, and but it takes a while to get deeper and to get into those deeper currents where you might have the fish with the one little light coming off of its forehead that kind of really knows what's going on. So for me, I have to do my time, and
A 30-second Google search won't suffice.
Not for me. For more skilled people, undoubtedly so. But it's pretty out here, so I need whatever excuse I can get.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cleo. Terrific comments. Gaining trust of the people that you're interviewing certainly is of paramount importance. I want to move on now to Adam Ross. Adam is, as I said earlier on, someone that I've had the pleasure of working with in the past, and I hope we will continue to do so in the future. Adam, just quickly, how did you get started in this business? And I know, interestingly, something I just found out, that you actually are a licensed private investigator in addition to just all your other investigative skills that you've acquired over the years. But how did you come to get started in this business in the first place?
Well, I just need to bring myself out of listening to Cleo, because I was really captivated by that. I yesterday spent a day listening to other investigative journalists, and I have the luxury of working for private sector clients mainly, and do not have to put myself out there in the public eye, and particularly revealing findings that are uncomfortable for a lot of people. So I have a lot of respect for the work that you and other investigative journalists do. So to answer your question, I'll kind of take it in two parts, Norman, because I have two hats that are relevant here. One is my work as an investigative researcher. The current iteration of that is Templeton Research, the firm that I'm a co-founder of. And the other aspect is my civil society work, so with Transparency International Canada. So I'm a recovered business school grad. I went into the NGO sector from there, and began looking into human rights abuses and corruption, and the intersection of natural resource extraction and corruption and human rights abuses. Did that for a while, and then for pragmatic reasons, paying off student debt and so on, found myself looking for something that paid a little more. And I stumbled into this cottage industry. I was in London in the UK at the time, and met some corporate investigators, and put a job application in at an outfit called the Risk Advisory Group, which is one of many mid-sized London-based firms, and found myself working in the midst of oligarchs fighting their civil battles in London courts, internal investigations at big corporates and financial institutions, some corruption investigations, and there was this whole world of intrigue, and having come from a very black and white interpretation of the world and good and bad, I quickly realized that it is more a spectrum of grays, and and so worked there for several years, and then set out on my own as a freelancer. There's an army of subcontractors in this field, and so I worked for about a dozen different firms before kind of mustering the courage to partner up and try and grow a business myself. So the other side, the Transparency International work, I think, which is equally, if not more relevant here. It all started with a contract to write a report on the lack of transparency in particularly ownership of companies and property in Canada. And that bit of research came at a time when there was a lot more public attention on beneficial ownership transparency. And I can go kind of revisit this a bit later, but that type of work was public facing, right? And so you needed a hook, and I found a hook in getting a data set of 100 valuable properties in BC, and looking at who owned them. And I found that half of those properties were owned through corporate entities, the owners of whom we couldn't identify. And that could all be distilled into a soundbite or a single statistic, which the press slapped up and public officials ran with, that we didn't know who owned half of the most valuable properties in the province. And that was in the midst of a housing crisis and kind of runaway cost of living. And so that kind of got the snowball rolling downhill. And from there, worked on the Peter German dirty money investigation, as you'd mentioned, and the Cullen Commission. Now we find ourselves in an environment where we've had regulatory reforms. We've got there's a lot of work still to be done, but we're actually seeing some policy change, and this is in the public eye. And I think it's pretty striking how quickly momentum can build, and you don't know exactly when that's going to happen and what the catalyst is going to be.
Mm-hmm. Quite a history. Fascinating. Now, both of us, we've worked together on investigations in Canada and in Europe as well. Avi mentioned sort of some of the differences between accessing public records in Canada versus the US versus Europe. I don't know anyone more suited to answer this question than yourself, which is, can you give us just an idea of what it's like as an investigator to access data in Canada versus Europe? And certainly Europe has undergone a massive change recently through GDPR, where data which was previously available is now no longer available or accessible to the public.
Yeah. So I think the stark contrast is between kind of Canada and Europe on the one hand, and the US on the other, where the US is an investigator's playground. It's they have such a different approach to personal privacy from Canadians that it's just on the other extreme end of the spectrum. And I had shared a link earlier about the kind of the origins of that data ecosystem, and one of the people who was behind it. It's an entertaining read. I think if you can share it with the people watching. So in Canada, we take a much more European view of personal privacy. It's kind of taken to an extreme, and so we don't have these tracer databases, these credit header data sources. We don't even have comprehensive phone books in Canada. What we do have is publicly available data. It's just not easily accessed, and it can't be repackaged, or has not been repackaged by firms with the intention of investigative researchers consuming that information and being able to analyze it. So, I think the example of corporate registries is a good one. So you have 13 corporate registries within Canada. Only one at this point has a public API, or bulk downloads, where that can be integrated into a third-party database like Open Corporates, where you can search by director name or by registered address. The others, you can only search by company name, which does not help you very much as an investigator when you're looking for what corporate interests could be connected to an address or connected to an individual's name or some other data point. We also paywall a lot of our data sources, our public data. So that creates barriers for journalists and civil society investigators. And that's, I think, not just true of corporate registries, but land registries, and other sources of what is technically public information.
So if you're engaging in corrupt activities, then this environment, is that helpful to someone?
It's absolutely helpful. Yes. It creates barriers to following a trail and establishing patterns and making connections. We are slowly moving towards a more transparent regime, at least around company ownership, and I think that will deter people from registering companies in certain Canadian jurisdictions. Specifically people looking to abuse those companies or conceal things through them. But Canada remains a very attractive jurisdiction for people looking to conceal assets or use Canadian entities for corrupt purposes.
I just had a question in from the audience, which is sort of right up your alley here, which is, can a Canadian investigation make use of U.S. data due to U.S. data availability?
Yes. So with some caveats. So we can use the data. A lot of the data providers, or almost all of them, require an individual to be licensed in the US and based there. Even if Avi were to travel outside the country, under the terms of his license, he wouldn't be able to access those databases. And so you either need to partner with somebody in the US or you need to have somebody in-house who has access to those databases, but the data contained within them can still be used in investigations where there's a cross-jurisdictional element. So that's, mapping out somebody's address history and property ownership and the vehicles that they've owned and driven in the past, like in the US, is not going to necessarily be useful for a Canada-focused investigation.
Mm-hmm. So you're on the board of Transparency International Canada, and certainly Transparency International is extremely well known for its Corruption Perceptions Index. Can you just very quickly let us know sort of the role of investigators or the methodology and how they arrive at their findings?
I think it really depends on the nature of the investigation, right? Things that I take into account from the outset is, what's the end purpose? Who's the end user? What's the purpose of the research? Where are we looking? What do we know about the research subject? So I think contextualizing the investigation is really important from the outset. Different industries have their own quirks in terms of how business is done. That's true across cultures and jurisdictions as well. For instance, real estate developers structure their holdings in a certain way, and private equity firms structure it in a very different way, and understanding those nuances is really important as a starting point. Also understanding the information environment you're working in, right? So is it an information rich environment where you can get a lot on the public record, or is it an environment where you're going to run out of road pretty quickly in the public domain, and so you need to leverage human sources and speak to people there, and understanding when it's more relevant to talk to people or use what's on the public record, and then which OSINT tools you can bring in for the specific use cases.
Which is part and parcel of how you structure an investigation. I mean, the first one that you and I worked on was an asset search, and you told me at the beginning, because the client had asked, what's your methodology going to be with this asset search? And so I forwarded that question to you, and your answer was, well, with an asset search, you can't really tell at the beginning which direction the road is going to take you, because it will invariably go off in 30 different directions. So you just have to start small, go to a few data sources at first, and then it's just going to unfold from there. But not every investigation is an asset search. Sometimes you're looking to compile information on a suspected criminal or a suspected corrupt official. So how do you structure those types of investigations?
I actually think, if it's okay, I'd like to kind of go back to that project, because I think
Sure.
that's an interesting one. And it took place in the private sector, but it was essentially a corruption investigation, right? Because this was somebody who had defrauded creditors and was using money that had been loaned for a business for purposes unrelated to that business. And so the starting point was, what's the context here, right? This was a Chinese businessman who had come to North America to invest in a particular industry. And so we started out by thinking, okay, well, given we understand that about him and where he's coming from, where are the large diaspora centers? What types of assets do people from his demographic, and this is not just his nationality, but his net worth and the industries that he's been involved in, and that led us to real estate in BC. It led us to companies in Alberta. It led us to property in Hawaii, and I think, rather than kind of structuring the full investigation from the outset, we said, let's take stock at the beginning, understand the context, understand the jurisdictions, kind of test the waters, and then if we identify leads, we start pursuing those that are most promising. And throughout that process, you need to check back in with the client and make sure that you're on budget and on time. And I think another important element is tracking your research and documenting as you go. And there are tools to do that online, like OSINT Forensics and Hunchly. But you can also just take screenshots as you go, and you download documents and save them in a case file, and make sure that there is an audit trail for yourself. And I think the extent to which you need to do that really depends on the context of the investigation. Is this going out into the public record? Is it litigation support, or is it for like internal use and intelligence purposes, in which case the standards may not have to be quite as high.
Yeah, I like your comment about sort of making an interim report. You have to let the client know, this is what we found so far, but we think maybe we should be heading in this direction or that direction. Do you agree? Or can you give us a few more weeks, or can we change the budget or what have you? Because we've got some very, very promising leads in this direction, as opposed to what you looked at originally as the idea of this investigation. Things change. They change all the time, and it can depend on information that you've received through a discrete interview, through obtaining a public record, a court record, or what have you, an ownership of a property. It can change the entire nature of an investigation. And so in keeping the client informed of that, rather than just dropping a bombshell on them on the deadline delivery date is probably not a great idea. So so thank you for that, Adam. We've got several questions coming in. I'll drop the first one for Abby. If you're still there, I hope you are. This is from Stephen Scott, who's had a lengthy career in law enforcement, and he wants to know. And again, I can't answer this because this is more for you. What do you think of the like of Spy Talks or Intellius, the mega type public records commercial services? He's in Canada. He doesn't use them. He has no use for them right now, but he's skeptical about their use, and he would like to know your thoughts on them.
Okay, so these are widely available general public records databases. They don't contain credited header information. And I think they're generally available to anyone who wants to subscribe and obtain them. To my purposes, I think they're wholly insufficient. And I would never rely on them really for anything whatsoever. Sometimes people ask me about these different searches, and we have in the United States, we have things like peoplefinder.com and all kinds of levels of things like this. I have no opinion about any of them because I just pay money for something that's much, much better than that. I think as a way to sort of get comfortable working with records and understanding what might be available, I think there's something to it. But really what you need to do, like for instance, let's say we're interested in court records, is maybe you pull one of these reports that gives you a sense of where your subject has ever lived and worked. But then you have to take that information and now go directly to the courts and the jurisdictions that they've identified. Which is to say that if you think that those websites have got the stuff in it that you need, you're going to mislead yourself in a big way. It's a garbage in and garbage out situation. Data is expensive. Obtaining data is expensive. Companies like Westlaw and Nexus have invested vast resources over vast periods of time to obtain the APIs. And even before APIs, companies like Nexus and Westlaw, they had teams of runners in all jurisdictions who every couple of weeks or month would go and obtain all the new dockets, and they would photocopy them and upload them, all that sort of thing. And then someone mechanically had to process them into the databases. This is of course a long time ago. And the problem is that all these searches want to give you the impression that they're incredibly deep and thorough. That's why you would choose and give them money. But the truth is they're very thin and very shallow, and they very, very rarely disclose what the actual scope of the search is. Because like what I would want to know is, if I'm interested in, say, San Francisco County, which is across the bay from me, and I was running a search, well, I would want to know what types of case files does it include? Does it include criminal? A lot of times, most times, these databases are very, very thin on criminal and much more robust on civil. How far back does the data go? That's a really important question too, because a lot of these new websites are only pulling much more recent data from the date of the API if they have that relationship. But if you're looking for something that happened 10 years ago, it's not going to be there. So the closer you can get every time to the source, the better off you're always going to be. Now, I understand sometimes you can't do that, but the good investigator is always looking to take that next step, which is there's something here, but I need to go the next step further. And that's really what distinguishes the good investigators from the lazy investigators, is not being satisfied with what's available, asking the question about what they have, and then thinking about what's the next step I could do to get even more information, to use my sort of thing, but to leverage off this in order to get something even better.
Great tip. Thank you so much for that, Abby. Another comment we have about is the role of forensic accountants. And Ali, did you use any forensic accountants in any of your investigations, particularly with the mailbox conspiracy?
I didn't use one in that case, but I have used them before. And, when we have tax cases or we have big fraud cases, it's important to hire a forensic accountant to check the government's work or to see if they're missing something or not accounting for something. So I have used them quite frequently in that sense. They're incredibly important. You've got to understand your own limitations in whatever field you are. And, so you have to reach out for people who are experts. So it's important that, you realize what you need and find the best person you can get and use their expertise, because no one person knows everything. So I have to rely on other people and trust them. And, talking about investigators for a second, one of the things I'm looking for in an investigator is I want them to use their judgment, and I want them to follow up on leads that they think are important on their own without having to come back to me all the time. So a good investigator will follow up on things rather than wait for directions on everything. So again, you got to reach out to the people who know and let them do their job.
Avoid the Superman complex.
Absolutely.
I can do it all. I know even in Brazil, some years ago, a client came to us with a suspected fraud case, and they had literally thousands of Excel spreadsheets to be examined in order to determine where the fraud was. Well, that is so far out of my wheelhouse. So we did hire a forensic accountant, and literally within a couple of hours, he had it all sorted. He just knew exactly what to pinpoint, how to do the pivot tables, et cetera, and it was terrific. And so, yeah, if you're an investigator out there and you need a forensic accountant, or you think you might need a forensic accountant, go for it, because that particular individual saved us a lot of time, a lot of money, and we were able to deliver a very successful result for the client. And actually, speaking of successful results, I want to just go to Cleo just for a second. So oftentimes investigators in these projects, we operate in a vacuum. We do the investigations, we do the research, we do the discrete interviews, we do all the OSINT searches, compile the data, we report our findings, submit it to the client. Then we never hear another thing. Sometimes they might get back to us, or sometimes not. But in your own experience, can you point to some sort of successful results from your work?
Well, you're talking about the Pacific and corruption on the panel. Just gaining more awareness. So that's not the end goal or hope. Obviously, what you want is, at least from my perspective, more space for the honest people, which means prosecutions of the corrupt people, raising the cost of being corrupt across the region that we're talking about, the Pacific Islands. Currently, there's very little downside to taking money. I mean, especially and specifically, and I can give specific cases of it, Chinese money. There's just no down. You don't end up in jail. You don't end up losing your position. And we see this at the macro level with what the Philippines have decided to do with the Chinese incursions into their waters, this sort of a radical transparency initiative, where they're showing the videos of the Chinese Coast Guard ships water cannoning their little resupply boats. That's very much the equivalent of a journalist writing about suspected corruption in a country, and it's an absolutely essential first step. But if that isn't then followed up by a rallying, for example, to use the Philippines case, of support for the Philippines, and we are starting to see that now. The Japanese are starting to talk about more joint operations with the Philippines, as are the U.S. But unless something actually happens, and to be completely clear, under the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration finding, these are Philippines waters, right? There's no legal confusion about this. So unless something actually happens to stop that Chinese aggression, all you're doing is publicizing what the Chinese can get away with. Right. So until you get that actual, and then people in the neighborhood, other countries will when they're similarly attacked, will know that nobody's going to come to their aid either. So it's the publicization of bad behavior is often a necessary first step, but it can't be the end. You then have to have actual real world consequences for that bad behavior if you're going to achieve the goals that that I think inspire a lot of us who are in the field, which is to make the world safer for honest people who just want to get on with their lives without living in fear of all sorts of different things, including arbitrary detention or being deprived of medical services. These are all things that we've seen happen related to corruption cases or alleged corruption in the Pacific Islands.
Certainly a picture is worth 1,000 words, and a video image is worth 1,000,000 words in many cases, particularly what's happening out there these days. I know that Ali is quickly typing an answer to one question that's come in from the audience, but I also have another question for you, which is hypothetically, let's say that a company suspects that one of its employees has been paying bribes to help the company win a new contract. What are the steps that should be taken, and should the company's law firm or in-house counsel take the lead, or should it go to an investigator first? Ali, are you there? Your mic is off.
Sorry.
There we go.
Well, there's two answers to that. The first thing is people have to understand that in-house counsel for corporations and companies, or lawyers who represent corporations and companies, do not represent employees. And there's a big mistake that an employee will go to the company's lawyer because it's free. They're getting, that's who they get, and tell them things and believe that they are representing them and their interests when they are not. Their duty and obligation and loyalties are to the company, not to the employee. So the second part of my answer is, if you have a situation like that happening, you need to talk to a lawyer, an outside lawyer. And in this case, there are specialized lawyers who are whistleblower lawyers around the country who do these kind of things specifically. And they can give employees specific advice as to what they should do, what they should be wary about, and what they might want to do next. And that includes employees who are part of the crime. That's what whistleblowers usually are. Corporation whistleblowers usually have this information because they were part of the crime. So if you are one of those people, or you just find out something, these are the lawyers you need to go to, are whistleblower lawyers, and they're out there.
Yeah, we've had some on our panels before in the past. There's several out there, and if anybody is interested, we'll be happy to steer you in the direction of the ones that have been on our panels, because they've been very active in writing the whistleblower legislation in the United States, not just acting in the field, but acting as opinion formers and essentially the catalysts for policy change in the state. So thank you for that.
One
Adam,
more thing, though,
yep.
just for the employee, the person who's asking the question, just because you go to a whistleblower lawyer doesn't mean you're going to become a whistleblower. You're really going to them for advice, to understand your position. So don't be afraid to reach out to a lawyer and think, oh my God, this means I'm going to have to do this. You're really just reaching out and saying, what are my options?
Okay. Adam, we have another question for you. This is one that I get right up my alley as well. This is the role of investigators in conducting due diligence on a potential business partner. I guess this would be like a background check, really. So what type of person is best suited to do that sort of work, and how can they effectively do it at an arm's length so that the company gets the unvarnished and unbiased truth?
Right. That type of work is our bread and butter. Probably about 2/3 of the assignments we get are integrity due diligence. I guess there's two parts to that question, right? What's a good skill set? What do we look for in due diligence researchers? And then how do we do it at arm's length? So I think the same traits that we look for in investigators or that make a good investigator, so tenacity, inquisitiveness, attention to detail, an ability to see the forest from the trees and understand context, and to communicate clearly, right, with clients as well as with colleagues. Just a few traits. So you know, doing this at arm's length, you start with the public record. You always start with what's available online and what's available in the public record without that doesn't require any consent or tipping off the people that you're researching. And that helps to build an understanding of your research targets. It helps to, you can often get enough for a client without having to go to another phase of work, which might include site visits or speaking with people. So doing source inquiries. Source inquiries, which is like human intelligence gathering, speaking to people who are kind of in an informed position, is a whole other skill set. We often use specialists who might be former journalists or people who have a background in investigative interviewing. For that work, we use former headhunters as well, and increasingly we use expert networks, which is a model to, it's a relatively new model where you know who you're speaking with. They don't necessarily know your background. It's organized through a broker. You pay for their time, but it's all very transparent. You get a transcript, and that works very well for speaking to people at kind of the upper tiers of large organizations. So people who may not give you the time if you were to cold call them. Yeah, you need to balance it often with the client through an iterative process, the risk of tipping off a subject to your inquiries and your research, with the desire to get access to information from sources closer to that subject, because you can tinker around on the fringes and not get much of use, and there's a low risk of tipping off. But if you're actually looking for meaningful information, there is a trade-off there.
And is it more difficult or less difficult if the company, and I've had this happen a couple of times recently, where the company has been informed by my client that they're going to be investigated, that there are going to be some background checks done on certain individuals within the organization, and then it's our job to go in and really, you know, find out what we can about those particular individuals, knowing that, you know, they know that they're being investigated. I don't know who they've spoken to in the organization and what they've told people, if at all, you know, to tell people like me who come around knocking on the door. Have you been involved in that situation as well?
I have, and it, I think it can be helpful if you're given the keys to the castle and it's done very openly. And so employees know that you're doing this due diligence and you can contact them. That's very rare, where you're actually working with management team. More often in those situations, it's external counsel or private equity firm where your client has said, yeah, they know that we're doing due diligence. It's okay. We don't need to worry about tipping them off. And actually that hasn't been conveyed in an accurate manner to the subjects of the research, and they can get very defensive once they realize that there is a third party looking into them and their affairs. And I prefer to do it without a company's knowledge or without the subject's kind of consent and understanding, rather than that midway point of them being aware that maybe some due diligence is being done, but not really understanding how that works in practice.
Right. So this, as you mentioned, this ability to interview people, essentially, whether they know they're being investigated or not, or if they've given permission to be investigated. It's a critical skill to have. And again, this is going back to Ali's point, sort of about the Superman complex. Not everybody, you might be a maven with online tools, you know, and going into using all the great online tools that are out there, but you might not really have that ability to elicit information out of someone on a face-to-face basis. So you may have to go outside your little comfort zone and hire somebody who has that ability. And I think, Cleo, you probably have that ability yourself. All the people that you have to interview, particularly out there in the, pardon me, in the island nations of the Pacific, who may not be so willing to talk all the time, particularly in that type of environment. I know that Ali probably is in a similar situation where people in Hawaii, given the close-knit aspect of the environment there, they might not be willing to spill the beans so much. How do you get around that? Do you do it yourself, or do you try to find somebody else maybe who's, you know, maybe in Ali's case, you know, a native Hawaiian, for example, might have more luck in getting information?
So I'm not very good at telling when people are lying to me, which is a bit of a problem. But what I can tell is what people want me to think, which can be kind of helpful in its own way. So I don't use anybody else. I do everything whatever I can. I have to be able to take responsibility for it. And so I can't pass on a job. I mean, I will, you know, I just did a big project looking at a very specific topic in the Pacific Islands and hired local experts. And part of the local experts, and there were people from the countries, were to introduce me to people when I went there, because it's often hard to kind of get past that first layer of sharks. So you have that concept of, I mean, there are a bunch of different words for it, but but you then have to be aware that the person who is introducing you carries their own set of baggage, and because of the nature of those societies, it's an extended, people will remember what somebody's great grandfather did to wrong their great grandmother, you know, 80 years ago, right? So they're carrying all that baggage into it. But that's why the way that I can navigate through that is just my topics are really specific. You know, in this project that we're working on, we're looking at the concept of national security coordinators within the Pacific Islands and what their roles are, because and specifically in the 3 U.S. freely associated states, Palau has a national security coordinator, and she is essential for dealing with this wave of people from the outside who are coming in, international militaries, and the kind of groups of people coming up who don't want the militaries operating there, or concerned about organized crime or whatever, just as a kind of a one-person coordination thing. And that is a position that was created by executive order, but they want to make it statutory, and it's not moving through the legislature. So the question is, why is it not moving through the legislature? Is it for the reasons that the Senate members say it is, or is there something else going on? Something, you know, those sort of issues. So taking a very specific topic that may have tendrils in 100 different places, but you trying to three-dimensionally understand that one issue is possibly viable. You know, possibly, maybe not, but that's how I would navigate it. I don't, you know, but unlike you, I'm not given an assignment. I'm creating my own assignments. So I can make them as manageable as I am capable of, and say something else this is just too complicated for me, or I don't know the people, or or have access to the information I need in order to be able to address this properly. And then I just won't write about it. But if I find these little pieces along the way, I'll put it on LinkedIn. Good luck to somebody else to do something useful with it.
Got it.
And Twitter. Yeah.
Exactly. So Ali, how do you navigate the, the sort of the Hawaiian resident versus native Hawaiian environment in terms of speaking to people and eliciting information, particularly when somebody in there might be involved in a corrupt act?
Yeah, your point of, who do you send to speak to that witness is kind of critical. Some people respond to authority. They like lawyers talking to them. Other people want someone of their own ethnicity or race talking to them, someone who they can relate to. It is very interesting here because we do have such a mixed culture and different levels of education of who we think a witness will respond to. But what we call it talk story. So our investigators are very well trained in sitting down with somebody, and it's considered really rude in Hawaii to get to the point. So you sit down, you have coffee, you have tea, you have some food, you talk about family, you talk about where you went to high school. That's the way it's done in order to get someone talking. And we used to operate in American Samoa and Saipan, and it's the same kind of thing. If you get right to the point, like a lawyer likes to do, like I like to do, that's considered really rude, and you're not going to get anywhere. So my investigators are really good at talking story. But it does, sometimes we would very specifically say, this investigator is going to talk to this witness because of who they were. So you do have to look at those factors.
Fantastic point, and I think it's one that's easily applicable to a lot of cultures and environments around the world. I tend to be a little bit blunt sometimes, which might work in Australia, where people like to get right to the point, but in other cultures, particularly in Brazil, where people do like to talk about family first, very definitely, and then slowly you can get around to the matters at hand. Just so thank you all to our panelists today for all your comments and insight. I have one comment just closing before we get to our closing comments from John Ritchie, and this is from Cal Krusty, who is also very, very well known to those of you out there in LinkedIn land. He just wants to thank the panel for sharing their knowledge, and in this time in history, the murky clouds of geopolitics and enhanced risks, this panel is critical for all parties, business, politicians, lawyers, media, risk companies, and Canadians. So thank you for such a useful panel and discussion. So thank you all. Avi, Ali, Cleo, and Adam, your contributions today, I hope, have gone a long way to clearing up any questions, misconceptions, doubts, etc., that our audience may have had. I know that in the audience we had people that are involved in investigations, people that are thinking of getting involved in investigations, and people that have just had them dumped on their laps saying, now you've got to go and find out this stuff because nobody else can. So hopefully you've all learned a lot today. I certainly have. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you all. And I thank you all for your participation. Ali from Hawaii, Abby from California, Adam from here in Canada, and of course, Cleo from the far reaches of the Pacific out in Saipan. And I will now turn it over to my colleague at the Anti-Corruption Law Program, of which he is a co-founder, John Ritchie. And thank you all, and we'll see you at our next webinar in another month or so.
Thanks very much, Norm. This was a great discussion, and a few points really resonated with me. I think especially the comment made by Cleo about the importance of having some action following the exposing corruption. And action needs to address corruption that is exposed if it's to be meaningful. Also, I thought the comment about LinkedIn being a target-rich environment for soon to retire public servants, especially military, it was very interesting and offers a different perspective on all that. So I think this discussion demonstrated the importance of investigators to worldwide anti-corruption efforts and the variety of shapes and sizes that those investigations can take. We hope that through today's webinar, our audience has learned plenty of new ways to make their investigations more effective. So on behalf of my colleagues at the ACLP, Norm Baldwin, Alex Komarov, and Joe Weiler, I want to thank our moderator and our panelists for generously sharing their expertise with us, and to thank you, our audience, for your participation, especially those of you who commented or asked relevant questions. I'd like to also thank again our three supporting organizations, the Center for Business Law at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at UBC, Transparency International Canadian Chapter, and the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute. We're especially grateful to the Center for Business Law and our Technical Operations Coordinator, Nicole Suderman, without whom this webinar wouldn't have been possible. So as mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar will be available on our website in about a week. That website is accessible through the Center for Business Law website. All those who registered will also receive an email with a link to the recording, and it'll be available through LinkedIn as well. Thank you again for joining us today and for your continuing support of the Anti-Corruption Law Program. Thanks a lot.